Thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome. It's great to see a nice turnout like this, and to see a lot of old, familiar faces. I sometimes say old faces, but Dennis is always in the crowd, and he gets upset when I say that. So I can't do that anymore. I'd also like to give special thanks to Bob Stinson, who's right here someplace. Bob was the organizer of this event, but Bob got ill about 3 days ago, and so he's unable to fill in. I'm filling in for Bob, I should say. So, as you said, my name is Jim Boland. I'm a member of UUC, and on the steering committee for a group we call Defending Democracy, which got started in April. I know there are a couple of members, or at least one other member of the steering committee here. Would you raise your hand if you're on that steering committee? I know Danny's here. We've been giving presentations since April around the region to highlight what we consider to be some of the issues that have to be addressed to save democracy or defend democracy. We're nonpartisan. We don't talk politics. What we talk about is what democracy means, how it comes under threat, how it can be challenged, and how you preserve it. Because I particularly believe democracy is the best form of governance that there is, and we need to make certain that we defend it. It's, because it is so open, it's also open to threat. And so we like to highlight what those threats are and how you recognize them and how you can defend against them. We've held about 7 or 8 meetings around the New River Valley and in Roanoke. There's an active group in Roanoke that we work with. We've got a couple of events coming up that I'd like to highlight. One is on September 5th at the Lyric Theater, because it's 7:30 in the evening. It's on disinformation in the digital age, how you ascertain what is misleading information and how you kind of protect yourself against that. And we have another event coming up that we don't sponsor, but is we certainly support, is this coming Saturday at the Huckleberry Park in Christiansburg. There's one on multiracial aspects of democracy that is actually an annual event, and so we would encourage you to attend. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker for the day. This is Chris Crawford, and thank him for volunteering his time to come to Blacksburg to speak. Chris lives in the Washington, D.C. area. We connected with Chris at the recommendation of several people. He is a policy strategist for a group called Protect Democracy. It's a nationwide nonprofit dedicated to identifying authoritarian threats, building more resilient democratic institutions, and protecting freedom and liberal democracies. His work has focused on ensuring that there are free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power. He previously worked as a senior program associate at a group called the Democracy Fund, where he managed a portfolio on faith-based initiatives that promote pluralism. So he has a bachelor's degree in political science from George Washington University, and speaking with him earlier, had to kind of be a very gentle introduction because he got his master's at Notre Dame, and I grew up in East Lansing, Michigan, and there was some sense of rivalry between those two. But we greatly appreciate Chris coming and to share his insights on faith and democracy. Chris?
Thank you very much. The only appropriate way, I think, to start is to say thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for being here, giving up time on your Sunday, giving up your time between now and the election to do the important work that you're doing. So just want to start by saying thank you. You can go to the next slide. I am Chris Crawford with Protect Democracy. He did a very good job laying out my role, what our organization is. One thing I would say that I think is important as a way of introduction is to recognize that Protect Democracy is not a religious organization. We are a secular organization, nonpartisan, nonprofit. So why do I spend time going around the country talking to faith communities? We can go to the next slide, please. One of the things that's central to our work at Protect Democracy is that we believe that in order to protect democracy against authoritarianism, you have to be able to build a broad coalition of people who might have big disagreements on politics or policy, but who nevertheless are willing to prioritize the defense of democracy. And frankly, we cannot build that coalition without people of faith. Faith-based institutions are central to building that coalition, and throughout our history as a country, that has been the case. So we can go to the next slide here. I like starting my sessions by hearing from the people that I'm going to talk to get a sense of how you're feeling. So what I want to invite you to do is just take a couple minutes, pair up, or just discuss at your table what is one sentence or one phrase that comes to mind when I pose the question, how are you feeling about the 2024 election? I'll give you a minute and then I'll call us back and call in a few people. People, I forgot to set a timer, but I'm hearing the conversation start to dwindle. So just a couple people. Does someone want to raise their hand? Yes. Anxious but hopeful. Sir?
Threat. Fear and
Threat. One more?
Project 2025.
Oh, that's great. This is a smart group. This is a well-informed group. You said Project 2025. I like to do this at the beginning because it's good for me to hear and get a sense of how people in the room are feeling. And I'll say these are familiar terms that I've been hearing when I ask that question to different groups. So the next slide will have, they've given me 4 questions to try to address today. And the first one I'm going to break into 2 parts. Why is democracy important to faith communities? And so I'll start there. And the next slide, please. Essentially for me, every freedom that we care about, including our religious freedom, rests upon a foundation of democratic values, institutions, and the rule of law. Many of us across religious traditions believe every person has human dignity. As a Catholic, I believe every person is made in the image and likeness of their Creator. And I believe that of all the different forms of government, democracies are the best way to ensure human flourishing, human rights, and to protect against abuses of power. I also would contend that our pluralistic democracy is essential to maintaining peace, especially as we try to make progress on issues that we care about. I know for a fact, especially in a room as big as this, there are policy issues that we might disagree on. In a democracy like ours, we can have those disagreements. We can try to make progress, win over our fellow citizens to try to make progress. If we lose that ability, we lose everything. And the last thing I'd say on that question is our ability to advocate for those issues depends upon things like free and fair elections, peaceful transfer of power, the existence of pluralism, both in our political culture as well as in our laws and our institutions. Even our ability to practice our faith without coercion or punishment is a fundamental freedom that's protected by democratic values and the rule of law. Now, the second question, the second part of this question that I'd like to address in the next slide is, why is it important that we as people of faith step up and lead in the defense of democracy? The first piece is basically what I just talked about, that we have the values that can inform this work. I'd also say religious communities often have the social capital and the organizing infrastructure to take action in our communities. Who here is involved in some sort of charity or social justice work through your house of worship? You're all here, so you could all raise your hand. Anyone want to just shout out what the ministry is that comes to mind for you?
Food pantry.
For food pantry? And that's one that comes up a lot. And then if you just think about the issues facing our communities on a day-to-day basis.
Christmas school.
A Christmas store? I like that one. I'm coming back to Blacksburg. When you think about the long-standing issues that our communities face, churches, synagogues, mosques, interfaith groups are often the institutions that build the infrastructure to take action. And I think we need to apply that to our democracy as well. I also would note that religious leaders are often some of the most trusted leaders within a community. Nationally, the numbers are trending downward. Nationally, the concept of a religious leader is not as well trusted as they might have been a decade or 2 decades ago. But in local communities, people still turn to faith leaders and faith institutions as trusted. And I want to also add something that I think is important here. When I say faith leaders, there are people who wear collars, there are people who have official roles, but I'm also including lay leaders whose work is inspired by their faith and who it might just be their leader in their neighborhood. They're trusted because their faith inspires them and they can meet the needs of their communities. Lay leaders are faith leaders too. It's not just the institutional leaders. I also think it's really important personally that to understand the way that spiritual or religious grounding can help us take action even when the odds feel long or we're under threat. You think about the civil rights movement in this country, the way that faith was this wellspring for them, and something they could draw on to make progress even in the face of state-sanctioned violence. On the next slide, I know that it's not only Christians in this room, but I also think it's important to call out the fact that part of the reason we are at this perilous place in our democracy is as a result of activity by Christians in our politics, and it continues to be. And I think we have a special calling as Christians to be active in the movement to preserve democracy. There are people in our country who are distorting our faith to support authoritarianism. There are people in our country who are being manipulated both by Christian leaders and secular leaders who want to weaponize our Christian faith. We have brothers and sisters in Christ who believe that they are so under threat that we don't need democracy, we don't need pluralism. And they've been convinced that gaining and holding power is of the utmost importance, and it's even more important than upholding the teachings that we find in our Bibles. And from a civic standpoint, they've also been told that our institutions are not worth preserving, and that holding power is important enough to break those institutions up to and including overturning the rightful results of an election. This form of Christian engagement would undermine our democracy, and it will find its most effective opposition in the pews of the American church. The best antidote to this movement will not be a savvy political strategy. It will be a strategy of loving our neighbors and rooting ourselves in an alternative, deeply rooted, gospel-inspired politics as Christians. That could be another half-hour talk that I wasn't asked to give today. But on the next page, we'll have some resources for you here. Especially my friend Michael Ware's book, The Spirit of Our Politics, is a really wonderful resource. And this brings us on the next slide to the second question that I was asked to address, which is how can we dialogue with people from different political views? And so on the next slide, you'll see 2 organizations from whom I'm borrowing resources and bringing them to you today. One of them is One America Movement, which is based in Virginia, but they're a national organization focused on combating toxic polarization. And the other is Disarming Leviathan, which is based in the Phoenix area in Arizona. It's a wonderful ministry. And so on the next slide, I just wanted to include the link. I'm sort of boiling down a lot of information from the How to Talk to Your Neighbor guide that One America Movement put together. And the next slide will list out some of the central themes that go with this. So the first thing is be sensitive. So this is when you're having a dialogue with someone that you might disagree with on a general sense. Be sensitive going into the conversation. When you're thinking about the issues that you're talking about, think about the person you're talking to and how that issue might impact them personally. What are they bringing to this conversation? So that's an important way that we can ground ourselves at the start of the conversation. And then a lot of these have to do with listening well. I think especially with the programming that we have on TV, we see people trying to listen to make a good counterpoint or to try to retort what was just said. What we want to do when we're talking with our neighbors is listen to learn, listen to understand. When we ask them questions, we want to ask questions in order to learn more about their point of view, where they're coming from. And not just thinking about how you're going to respond. I note as I went through this is also good advice for talking with anybody. Talking to your husband or wife, use these too, really helpful. Another thing I'd say is be present and attentive to cues and emotions. As the conversation's going on, recognize the body language of the person that you're talking to and how what you're saying might be landing with them. And in the same way, think, how am I feeling in this conversation? Am I tensing up? Am I hunching over? How am I feeling? And express that if you feel the need that you need to express that. And the last one, assume good intent, is important both on a one-on-one basis, but it also gets at one of the bigger issues to do with toxic polarization on the macro level. We can go into these conversations and try to drill down what's the hidden motivation of the person I'm talking to. If they disagree with me, they're coming from a bad place and I'm going to find that bad place. But most people aren't doing that. The reason that this gets dangerous when we think about it on a nationwide level is that in our political system, we feel that our opponents have more extreme views on average than they generally do. Poll after poll, issue after issue, Republicans think Democrats feel way differently and way more extreme than they usually do, and vice versa. The most dangerous manifestation of this is when it comes to political violence. No one who commits political violence thinks they're the aggressor. They think that they are under threat, that their opponents would resort to violence, so we have to escalate things in order to defend against them. And so when we get in this mindset of assuming the worst of other people, it can be really dangerous for our democracy. And now we can go to the next slide. So this is the Disarming Leviathan ministry, which is a really interesting ministry based in Arizona. This one's a little bit different from the Good Neighbors conversation because it's focused on more on a statement or a belief that someone you know is holding. So it's a little more specific in that regard. The Disarming Leviathan ministry is run by Caleb Campbell. He's a pastor in Arizona, and he wrote a book called Disarming Leviathan. And he's focused on pushing back against Christian nationalism, but he approaches it from the standpoint of a mission field. So the framework I'm going to share with you is similar to what missionaries use in trying to understand other people when they're trying to spread the gospel. Something that fascinated me in the book is that Caleb Campbell, the author of the book, is a former neo-Nazi. And he talks about the fact that he was not argued into neo-Nazism. No one came up to him and laid out a neo-Nazi belief and he said, yeah, that's where I want to go. They provided safety. They provided community. They listened to him at a time when he was lonely and he got caught up there. He also notes he wasn't argued out of being a neo-Nazi. There was a church community that listened to him, welcomed him, had him over for dinner, and he says, listen to him even when he was being stupid and offensive. But this approach of providing love and safety is a way to win people over that usually isn't the way we think about our politics or our public life. So what I'd like to do here, one last framing note. He's focused on Christian nationalism, but this, again, you could talk about pretty much any issue in this way. It's not a particularly progressive or conservative framework. It's just a different way of approaching these conversations. So what I'm going to do here is walk you through the elements and his questions, and then we'll do an exercise where I will ask you to try to change my mind on something. It's not going to be Notre Dame football. So these are the key elements. The first thing is when someone says something or holds a belief that you disagree with or even find offensive, start by asking clarifying questions. These are neutral questions to try to deepen your knowledge of their understanding. The next thing is finding possible shared values. What are the values underpinning the belief that's been expressed that you might agree with even if you disagree with their conclusion. And then there's shibboleths and red flags, which sort of go together. Shibboleths are statements that communicate, I am a friend. They're things you can say to this person to try to tease out some of those shared values in order to show that you're listening, show that you can be trusted. Red flags are basically the opposite of shibboleths. Red flags are things you could say that make the person feel like they're not listened to, or you're not taking them seriously. They're often personal attacks or minimizations. And over the course of the conversation, there's also what he calls good things to honor. And this again is like an extension of the shared values. What's underneath the rhetoric that you're hearing that you might be able to identify with before pivoting to what Caleb calls humble subversion questions. I really like that framing. The humble subversion questions are questions that could get someone to reconsider their point of view or statement. Examples he has are, how can we determine if what you just said was true? How can we do that together? How do we consider this in light of these other facts? Or how should you think about this topic in light of scripture, as an example? And these questions, I'll say, also help us learn more about ourselves. Everything that I've laid out here, I think, is also helpful to us because it makes us think more about our position in light of what we're hearing from the other person. So on the next slide, we're going to try this out. Pretend that I came up here and said, I fooled the organizers. I want to tell you that the 2020 election was stolen. And you have to try to use this framework to convince me to take back that belief, or to think differently is the better way to say it, to think differently about my position about whether the 2020 election was stolen. So I've come in here, I've declared this. I hope no one cuts that video, that could be bad. But what might you say? And we'll go through slide by slide so you can also see the definition. So on the next slide, asking a clarifying question or two. We'll just do one example of each of these for the purpose of time. Does someone want to ask a clarifying question of me on my fake belief that the 2020 election was stolen? What might be a clarifying question to ask?
What makes you feel like the election was stolen?
Perfect. That was the exact example in the book. Was what makes you think they were stolen? Also, which elections are you referring to? So trying to drill down on the facts of the matter behind what they're saying. And then also the other question on that one was, what are the protections in place to try to stop cheating in an election, and why do you think they didn't work? Something like that. So on the next slide, shared values. What shared value might you identify with someone who is concerned that the 2020 election was stolen? Right, that fraud is a bad thing.
Yeah,
Sir? Election integrity, exactly right. The examples he says are basically, we care about the democratic process. We believe in truth, fair play, and justice as one example. And then shibboleths. What's a way to signal to me that you're a friend and you're listening, even though you disagree with what I've just said? In the back?
I remember in 2016, people were saying
So for those who might not have been able to hear, he talked about how in 2016 there were people who raised concerns and who, when their side of the election lost, raised this type of thing so they understand what's underneath that. And again, similar, yes, election integrity is important. Everyone's vote should count. Things like that to show we all care about the integrity of our elections. Next is red flags. These indicate that you're not a friend. There might be personal attacks. Please be gentle with me, but who wants to start us off?
You're stupid.
You're stupid. Thank you.
Where's the evidence?
Where's the evidence?
You're a good old boy.
You're a good old boy. All right, that's enough of the red flag. You're nailing it. There's no way an election could be rigged. Those people are sore losers. You might add, you're a sore loser too. These are what we want to avoid. And then good things to honor. Happy to move on to this one. What are some of the honorable values that might be underneath this? And we sort of already got at this, but anyone have another thing to add? Concerns for family. That's a very good one. And then the last one is humble subversion. What are some ways that you can approach a question to someone trying to get them to reconsider as you try to learn more about their point of view. This side of the room's been more quiet. Anyone on this side of the room?
Ask them if they ever worked as a volunteer.
That's a great one. She said, ask them if they've ever worked as a volunteer. And that's something election officials have been doing and saying, is when they have people, I've talked to election officials who have gotten an angry phone call and their response is, I'm going to email you the poll worker form so you can come work at our elections and see how it works. Thank you for being concerned. Anyone else want to have one? I saw a hand in the back, I think. You can just shout it out.
It was about the same thing, just to ask if they know somebody who doesn't believe that elections were stolen.
Exactly. So a few more. I'm glad you care about this issue. I've heard these claims. How can we tell if they're valid? Let's say you do believe the election was stolen. How would Scripture call on us to respond? And would it be the way that some other people are responding? And then you all got this one very well. I wonder if we're called to serve in our community. What are some life-giving ways that we can work with our election officials? So thank you for being an attentive group, not just to this, but you came in knowing what you were talking about, which is exciting. Now we're going to go on to the next question, which is about sharing accurate information. Before I get into what I have, I saw these are the League of Women Voters pamphlets that are on the table when you came in. These are excellent. The League of Women Voters is one of the very best groups at sharing accurate information about our elections and helping people to understand on the front end where to find accurate information, where and how to vote. Is there anyone here from the League of Women Voters? All right, let's clap for the League of Women Voters, please. And I'm putting this in my folder so I can save it. But this is really important. I think we all need to be committed, especially as people of faith, to the truth and making sure we know where to find accurate information and that we're sharing accurate information. So this is the page I put together on mis and disinformation best practices. Takes a lot from Mormon Women for Ethical Government, which is a wonderful organization, one of my favorite partner organizations. I've included some links at the bottom here. The nice thing is they have a sources list, so you can know where to find accurate information. And then they also have ways of personal engagement with information. So starting here with sharing accurate information ahead of time. This is what the League is especially good at. When it comes to elections and sharing accurate information, we want to make sure that we're sharing information enough ahead of time that people not only have the information, but they know where to go for trustworthy information. Because we are not going to be able to track down every piece of misinformation or respond to every claim that's not true about our elections. What we need to equip our friends and neighbors with is what they need and where they can go to get the information. And primarily that's election officials, secretaries of state, .gov websites are where we want to be sending people. The second thing is don't amplify false claims. So as an example, if you in your churches, in your organizations were trying to spread accurate information about the election, it's election day and someone's spreading misinformation online saying, Virginia Tech students, your polling location closes at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. What you do not want to do in that situation is amplify it and say, you might have heard polls close at 4, they actually close at whatever the accurate time is. Because we have such short attention spans. People might just see the words, the polls close at 4, and they'll think, oh, I'm not going to be able to vote. So you want to make sure that you're not amplifying the false information. And then we all need to encourage people to question our sources and recognize our emotions and biases. I'll give you one example of my own bias. On the next slide, please. I am not supposed to hate anyone, but I hate the New York Yankees. The Lord is still working on me. But here's a piece of misinformation. If I saw a news story that said Yankee star Aaron Judge took a go-kart from an amusement park, drove it right off the lot, and stole it and took it home, my first reaction would be the Yankees are a bunch of bums. He definitely did it. Throw him in jail. But if I thought about it for a minute, I might ask questions like, can't Aaron Judge buy an entire amusement park if he wanted to? I also might say, that's a large man. How did he get in a go-kart in the first place? And so my bias might take me to even extreme places that you might not even believe you could go to and what you could believe about another person. But you still have to keep it in check. we can go back to the list. But it's not always that easy. The claims that we're seeing are not always so outlandish. So what we need to do is think about getting multiple sources for what we're looking at, make sure that we're checking our facts, and ultimately take responsibility for the information that you're sharing, whether it's on social media, whether it's over email, whether it's verbally with friends. We need to take responsibility and not say, well, I read that, so I shared it. We need to really make sure that we are taking responsibility before we share. The only last thing, my wife reminded me to speak in positives and don't just tell them, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. But don't use AI chatbots to get your election information, please. They are not accurate on a lot of things. They're very helpful for some things. Go to your election official websites to get your information on the election, please.
What if we don't know what they are? What's an AI chatbot?
Okay. Don't look it up. Just, artificial intelligence, there are chatbots on different platforms that you can ask it questions, it will give you answers. They are still being worked on to get more and more accurate. But I have been surprised, frankly, asking basic questions to it, like trivia questions, that it gets wrong. And it's just, the stakes are too high in an election to use that new technology in this way. It holds promise in some ways for the future. It could make things more efficient in other ways. We are not there in the 2024 election.
I do want to raise a point to be very careful because the search engines are using AI now. And so you need to be careful when you use search engines that you go to the source and not just the content that it's giving you.
If folks couldn't hear that, she was saying that the search engines are using artificial intelligence more and more to inform the search. So again, try to go check multiple sources for information and try to go to the primary source. That's really the most important thing if you can get there. So now we are at our last question, which is, what can we do? On the next slide, please. Oh, we're back there. Okay. What can we do? What kicked off the conversation with your leaders here back a number of months ago was that Protect Democracy and Interfaith America are partnering on a project called the Faith and Elections Playbook. And this is an online resource that we basically took a bunch of good information, very much not something that I put a bunch of my own, I did not create these initiatives. I went and found initiatives that were happening around the country that faith groups could plug into to help ensure a free and fair election and a peaceful transfer of power. We put them on a website called the Faith and Elections Playbook, and the idea here is to provide a menu of options for how folks can engage, and also to provide things like frequently asked questions, how-to guides. We can actually go to the next slide, has the, actually one more, has the link to the Faith and Elections Playbook. It's on the Interfaith America website. But the idea here is we've got frequently asked questions, checklists. We're really trying to make it so we are doing the hard work on the front end and faith communities are doing the implementation. It's also important here, there are a lot of different options in there because we want faith communities to be able to find ways to take action that align with their values, their skill sets, and the specific needs of their communities. This is all about trying to provide for faith communities around the country where they are. And all of these are nonpartisan, they've been checked by lawyers, they're all C3 activities. And so I'm going to go through them one by one. We'll skip this slide because that's just a list of them. And some of these I'll go through quickly because we already covered them in the previous parts of the conversation. One point I would make on the polarization track of work is just that we have a bunch of guides linked on the website. So you can go in there and say, what are the most important conversations related to polarization and bridge building for our community? How do we talk across faith traditions? How do we have internal conversations? We've got a bunch of different guides there because addressing polarization is really important and will make all of the other work in the election easier if we're not feeling so divided. The next one on the next slide is posting trustworthy information on where and how to vote. if you have a bulletin, if you have a website, if you have a newsletter, just getting the accurate information out ahead of the election and telling people where to go to check for updates can be really valuable. And then on the next slide, we start talking about ensuring a positive, peaceful process at polling locations and having a physical presence there. We love our elections. They're often a celebratory environment, a really exciting environment, but they can also be tense. They also can be, we can be concerned as we're at our polling locations. We might have long lines for one reason or another. And so these next couple of items are focused on helping provide a positive experience. And so one of them is providing food and water at polling locations, especially important if you have long lines. If you can go to a designated area and have food and water available. There are different rules in different locales on what you can and can't do. We've got a checklist there from an organization called Pizza to the Polls, which literally, if you are at a polling location, there's a long line, you can use their app and say, there's a long line at this polling location, and they'll deliver a pizza so that the people have something to eat in line. I haven't tested it, but they told me that you can't do it when you're filling out a mail-in ballot at home. They won't bring it in. And so we work with them. We based our checklist off of their checklist because they know how to do this really well. And the next thing is providing a peaceful presence. I don't know if any of you have done a training with Faiths United to Save Democracy, but they're one of the big organizers of poll chaplains, which are chaplains, people of faith who provide a peaceful presence at polling locations. They are also trained on de-escalation. So if there's a tense moment at the polling location, bringing peace to the polls is something that our communities can do. And on the next slide, we have recruiting poll workers. We need 1 million poll workers across the country in 3,000 counties, staffing 117,000 polling locations. And we're short-staffed right now. There was a dip during COVID, and we haven't fully recovered from that. We need enough poll workers to ensure that our elections run smoothly and that we don't have to close polling locations. It also can help to make sure we have shorter lines if our elections are staffed enough. The people who serve in these positions are everyday people, well-trained. They're doing things like checking in voters. They're doing things like making sure the process is working, often counting votes. Has anyone here served as a poll worker? Wow. Thank you very much. So talk to them. Hopefully it was a positive experience. I'm sure it was. I've heard just wonderful things. And it's one of those ways too, is people of faith, our values of hospitality and things like that really can help us to not just fill that space, but serve in a loving way that can be helpful and loving to our neighbors. And we've got on the Interfaith America website, we've got a link to an organization called Power the Polls, which makes it really easy for you to sign up. They forward your information to your local election office and you'll be contacted to sign up. All right, our next one is building relationships with election officials. I really like this one. I think there's a lot of opportunity here, especially for a group like yours. You have someone who writes about your work. You have Dan at the Roanoke Times, who does a beautiful job writing about your work. Getting the word out about the transparency in our elections and how people can be a part of the transparent process can be helpful. So one way that we think about this is it's part of election officials' jobs to be accountable to the public and to share accurate information and to hear your concerns. So it might make sense even to have a group like this together and invite an election official to just come explain the process, answer questions. If you have an interfaith leadership group in your community that could either do a private meeting or do a public meeting, that's another thing you could do. The other thing that I think is really valuable that a lot of people don't know about our election system is that they test the election equipment ahead of the election, and it's done publicly. And so in Virginia, you all vote on hand-marked paper ballots. Those are often tabulated by tabulation machines. And those are tested before the election. And election officials get frustrated because they say, all of these people are worried about how the process works, and no one shows up to see when we test the machines in front of everybody before the election. And I think that a wonderful way that faith communities can get involved in the election is to attend those and report out, whether it's in a newsletter, a letter to the editor, get Dan from the Roanoke Times to go with you and ask you about how the process is working. This is something that I'm really excited about how groups can get involved, and I'd even offer to help however I can. And then I think we have one more from the Faith and Elections playbook. This is one of the more complicated ones, I will admit, but I was surprised to know that about 20% of polling locations in our elections are houses of worship, because churches, synagogues, other faith-based institutions have big open spaces where you can set up election equipment. So this is a way that, again, we can ensure that the lines are shorter, we have enough places to vote, we have enough equipment. There's also a lot of work that goes in on the front end. What I wouldn't want anyone to do is go to your church council and agree to do this and then start planning, and then you find out that your space isn't ADA compliant, for example. Or what one election official told me, the biggest barrier to churches being polling locations is Monday night bingo. They can't be moved. They go to bring the election equipment in on Monday night, and there's an angry group of parishioners who say, you can't take our space, it's time for bingo. And so there's logistical things, but the nice thing about the Faith and Elections Playbook, partnering with a Jewish organization called A More Perfect Union, they have a checklist of all the questions to consider on the front end, because this can be a really meaningful way to serve your community. You just have to make sure you're following the rules. And I think we're at the end of the content. The only thing I'd say here before we take questions and go into the small groups is just, this is something that's going to take all of us. This is such a big moment for our elections and democracy. I hope that the information that we're able to provide will be helpful to you all in helping you find your way that you can get engaged in this election. And it's just such an honor to be with you, so thank you. The lights are on, I can see who's dozing off now. Any questions? And I don't know, how long do we have for questions? 10 minutes? Yes.
Hang on, I've got a mic I'll bring around.
Oh, great.
The extremists in a lot of Christian, semi-Christian organizations are very well organized. And especially as far as communication goes. How, because we're so diverse, how do we combat that those organizational communications?
That's a good question. I think as far as combating it, you want to build up an alternative. I think there's going to be, it would be hard to like infiltrate or do something like that. I'm not sure if that's what you're suggesting, but I think trying to find the ways that you can share accurate information is one of the biggest ways that you can do it. And try to find the ways that they're communicating and try to match it would be one thing. I don't know, I also want to welcome other people to respond here. You're all working on this as well, so I don't know if anyone else has something that they would add.
Yeah, there are organizations in it. I'm sorry, I'm in the midst of reading a book.
No problem.
Greatly concerns me. But like the Faith and Family organization
Yeah.
can be very extreme in some of their positions. We are a group of churches that normally don't communicate together.
Right.
And so, you know, there is an organization that has radio audiences of millions of people. And yet, you know, we also have millions of people that we don't communicate on a common basis.
Right.
So how can we as organizations do a better job of feeling like we're not out here alone?
That's such a great way of putting it. I think part of the challenge that we have that I see, this is just my own personal armchair diagnosis of some of this. I started my career actually working in the religious right. Part of the issue is that a lot of the infrastructure on the religious right is focused on get out and vote, and they have institutions that also are C4, PACs, more political. So they're more willing to be more partisan in ways that a lot of groups who are not within the religious right in faith-based communities, they're not as comfortable engaging in that way. And the big progressive nonpartisan faith organizations also don't want to have a counter to the religious right from the conversations that I've had. So there's not the infrastructure there. I think plugging in with some of the broader democracy movement pieces is one way, so that you have the information, you also know what is coming up as far as potential election crises, potential big issues. So tapping into some of the larger democracy movement. This is not Protect Democracy's position, my position. is also that some of the progressive institutions need to hear more from people through a faith lens and understand the important role that faith can play in organizing the big coalition that I talked about. That doesn't fully answer the question. He's going to fully answer the question.
I just wanted to respond to the previous question. I believe it is the case that there is an organization of ministers in Montgomery County, and they get together every so often. So there is an opportunity for the ministers from the different churches and the different faiths to get together, and if we want to give them questions to take to those meetings, we can certainly do that.
Three things I would recommend. One, red, wine, and blue is organizing women advocacy groups. Go join it. They're teaching you exactly what you talked about, how to listen and engage. If you haven't watched Bad Faith and God and Country, for God's sakes, do that, because it really gets across the Christian nationalist movement that he's alluding to. The third thing I would recommend is volunteer at the polls, because we have a Republican governor. 2 Republicans are now on the electoral board as opposed to 1 Democrat. And I can tell you in Montgomery County, because the Second Monday Constitution Group, they are cooking the books, so you better get involved. And the final thing I would encourage you to do, because I learned this from red, white, and blue, is you can go to the Virginia Department of Elections and get certified to take registrations out to get people to register to vote. And at your church, your young people need to get registered to vote, but looking around this room, you don't see many of them.
And voter registration is a C3 activity. I think people sometimes aren't sure about that. Is that you, sir?
We're here because we want to defend democracy. How big is the threat?
The question was, how big is the threat?
What are we defending?
I'll say, as an example, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I was always the person saying, everything's going to hold, everything's going to be okay, accusing people of engaging in hyperbole. I don't do that anymore. I think that our institutions are resilient, but I think our institutions need people to make sure that they're resilient. There's brilliance in our democratic institutions. There's not magic in our democratic institutions. And I'm very concerned. I think when you have the core of a political movement that is interested in overturning elections, that's really dangerous. It's dangerous in and of itself. We saw in 2020 an attempt to do that that came much closer than any of us ever thought it could have, and they're trying to do it again. And I also, the thing I get concerned with after a January 6th gets back to some of what I was saying on polarization, is I also think that people think, well, if the other side is doing it, we need to get active in the same way that they are. But I think this is, right now, it feels like a partisan problem. I think it's not just a partisan problem. I think it's a democracy cultural problem. And so it's a big problem, and I'm really concerned about it.
Chris, I would, to answer that question, one is, read Project 2025. Well, you can't read it, it's 900 pages long. But the gentleman back here, Red, Wine, and Blue did a fantastic job of synthesizing that. And Danny Axon back here in our group has put together a set of questions related to Project 2025. That if you read through that, and then you would see a little bit about why Chris is concerned and the threat. The other thing on bad faith, actually there is going to be a presentation of that at the Lyric Theater. I forget the exact date, sometime in September, yeah. And actually, I think Nancy McLean is going to be there also, who wrote the book Democracy in Change. So if you want to get engaged in that, I would encourage you to do that. We are working, our group, on putting together a website, as I speak, should be coming up, with a lot of these links to some of this stuff. So when it comes out, we've taken names and email addresses and have a fairly large database that we can send that out to. So anyway, hope that helps.
One other note on Project 2025, because I don't think most people want to read the 900 pages Protect Democracy, our C4 organization, has a website called authoritarianplaybook2025.org, and it outlines some of Project 2025, but it goes beyond that and ties in some of the themes of Project 2025 with what former President Trump has said about authoritarian tactics, what some of his closest advisors has said. So it connects things in a way that is helpful, especially at this moment where people who have been closely tied to Project 2025 and have espoused the beliefs and the policies in Project 2025, as they try to distance themselves now, that can serve as a reminder of this isn't some random project aside from the rest of the movement. And so I think that's helpful. It's still probably too long. It's like 90 pages, but we're working on infographics and short explainers as well. Yes, ma'am?
Question for the gentleman that said they're picking the books. What is, I want to know what he means by that.
I don't know what he means. But I want to be careful about language like that, about cooking the books, because we have a lot of safeguards in our election system.
Well, I've worked in elections, and my common refrain is, if you think it's fixed, you need to volunteer because there's no way. And so I wonder what he.
You mean fixed in a negative sense, right?
Yeah.
Not solved.
Yeah.
You mean if it's fixed.
If
like-
it's rigged.
Right.
To be inaccurate. Anybody who works in the polls, and there are a lot of us in here, it would be almost, it would be easier to get to the moon than to get a whole bunch of people who would have to all be involved to lie about the results of an election. And so I wonder what that comment means, because I would if there's something we need to know, I would like to know.
I think we should probably let that lie. I think your retort is well taken, and that's been my experience working with election officials, hearing from democracy experts, is that there are so many different safeguards throughout the election system, it would be almost impossible, especially because I think sometimes people think that we have some centralized system in our elections that we just don't. It's state by state, county by county. I also would say, I don't know how many people saw the governor's executive order that came out last week on elections. There were a lot of pieces in Governor Youngkin's executive order on elections that I think are not helpful, and I think there was some language that was imprecise as far as the management of the voter rolls. The thing to keep in mind, though, is ultimately that executive order was Glenn Youngkin saying, our election system is working. We are going to use paper ballots. And he outlined some of the safeguards that we should hold our leaders accountable to the transparency in our system, and also in the post-election period, remind them of how great they said the election was going to be run under their leadership. So I think there's an opportunity there as well. Yes?
We have time for one more question.
Okay, one more question.
I feel like now it has to be a really good question, and I don't think it is. One thing that's bothered me for a very long time is, I know our congregation is extremely careful about being nonpartisan, about, saying people should vote, but we don't talk about who they should vote for. And I don't think people who are saying that, for example, that Trump was sent by God, and therefore everybody in our congregation needs to believe that, and also people are, shunned in their congregations who don't believe that.
Right.
I don't see how we can compete with that. It seems like that's really stacking the deck. Do you have any ideas of how we can?
I think my starting point would be there are people that are willing to push the limits of that C3 IRS line in a way that I wouldn't recommend that anybody does. But I also think we shouldn't feel hopeless as a result of that. The choice is not between just lying down when it comes to that and letting them take up that space, or matching that level of enthusiasm. I think it's the view that we hear from some faith leaders about Donald Trump is really healthy, really unhealthy, not just from a democracy standpoint, but from a spiritual standpoint. What we can do is nonpartisan actions like registering voters, like helping people vote, like sharing accurate information. If we are willing to just look at the C3 and congregation-based lines and say, we are going to get active in our communities, we're going to educate people on issues, that's well within the C3 lane. You can talk about issues, you can generally talk about how office holders have acted on different issues. I have a whole other half-hour slide deck I can do on this, but we're not going to do that right now. But my advice would be, look at what you can do a lot of it and do it well, and that's the best way to counter it. And the other thing is, the congregations don't have to be the only home for this type of activity. If you feel inspired that in addition to the pro-democracy work, in addition to getting active on different issues, you feel like you need to knock on doors for a particular candidate, you should do that. And you should find the right institutions to do that. And some of them are faith-based as well. So I would say we don't have to mimic the unhealthy things that we've seen in order to serve in our democracy and help it work better. We can find the ways that fit what we want to do and what we want to see in our country.
Very good answer.
Thank you.
All right, thank you again to Chris for the wonderful presentation and to all of you for the questions. We're going to shift now to some breakout groups. Jesse, if you don't mind switching that slide. And big thanks to Jesse Delaney, who's running our AD for us today. We're actually going to make a slight change in our plans. We had anticipated for the breakout group time that we were going to ask you to shuffle yourselves around into